He manages buildings. Ambition was never really his strength.
There he is. My partner. That isn't mine.
Someone tried to move $8 million.
Who had access?
Stephen Scott was 44, and anyone walking past him in downtown Chicago would have guessed he was exactly what his Navy work shirt claimed, a facilities manager who kept office buildings running. Most people believed he had settled for an ordinary life, while his successful wife, Violet Scott, carried the marriage. They saw his aging Ford F-150 as homemade lunches and the same old steel watch he had worn for years. What they didn't know was that Stephen's signature quietly sat beside a real estate portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The ballroom fell silent when the host looked up from his speech, stared directly at Stephen, and whispered into the microphone, "He's actually here. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, leave a comment telling me your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burn stories where truth defeats appearances, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story." The first alarm rang at 4:45 every weekday morning. Stephen Scott never needed a second one. By 5 o'clock, the coffee maker in the small brick house on Chicago's northwest side had already finished brewing. The kitchen lights glowed softly while the neighborhood remained wrapped in darkness. Outside, only a few delivery trucks disturbed the quiet streets. Stephen folded the newspaper after scanning the local business section. His breakfast never changed: scrambled eggs toast, black coffee, and half a grapefruit. He believed routines made difficult days easier. The lunch he carried to work every morning sat neatly inside a faded, insulated bag. Turkey sandwich, apple, bottled water, a handful of almonds. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. Exactly the way he preferred. The stainless steel watch on his wrist had belonged to his father. It showed a few scratches after nearly 20 years of daily wear, but it kept perfect time. He slipped into a Navy Harbor Point Commercial Properties work shirt with his embroidered name stitched above the pocket. Stephen looked exactly like the man everyone assumed he was. Before leaving, he glanced quietly toward the second floor. Violet's bedroom light was still off. It had become normal for them to wake up at different hours. Years earlier, they had shared coffee every morning. Now they mostly shared a house. He picked up his keys without making noise and stepped into the cool October air. His 11-year-old Ford F-150 started on the second turn of the ignition. The truck wasn't polished. It wasn't stylish. But every maintenance record sat organized inside the glove compartment. Stephen believed that taking care of what he owned mattered more than replacing it. The drive toward downtown Chicago took 38 minutes before sunrise. Traffic was light. The skyline slowly emerged from the darkness, its glass towers reflecting the first hints of orange along Lake Michigan. By 5:50 a.m., Stephen pulled into the underground employee garage beneath Harbor Point Plaza. The security guard at Gate B smiled immediately. "Morning, Mr. Scott." "Morning, Luis." Luis Ramirez had worked overnight security for nearly 9 years. Stephen knew the names of Luis's 3 children. He remembered birthdays. He remembered when Luis's oldest daughter earned a scholarship to the University of Illinois. Most executives entering the building after 8 o'clock never noticed the overnight staff. Stephen always did. Inside the lobby, another familiar face waited beside the reception desk. "Coffee machine on 17 is acting up again," said Janice, one of the maintenance technicians. Stephen smiled slightly. "Already. It survived exactly 4 days. I'll take a look." There was no frustration in his voice. Problems were simply work waiting to be done. By 6:15, he had already inspected the building's mechanical room, approved 2 repair orders, reset a faulty HVAC controller, and coordinated an elevator inspection before most tenants had even entered the building. His official title sounded ordinary: facilities manager. But people inside Harbor Point knew better. When something expensive stopped working, when flooding threatened an office floor, when a power failure disrupted trading firms, when winter storms froze mechanical systems, executives stopped calling consultants. They called Stephen because Stephen solved problems, quietly, efficiently, without needing applause afterward. At 7:30, Harbor Point's Regional Operations Director Melissa Carter stepped off the elevator carrying a tablet. She found Stephen studying blueprints inside the maintenance office. "There you are." Stephen looked up. "Morning." Melissa laid several reports on the table. "I've got contractors arguing over the renovation schedule." Stephen reviewed the pages for less than 30 seconds. "The plumbing crew starts too early." Melissa blinked. "They're blocking electrical access." He pointed toward one drawing. "If electrical finishes first, you'll save 3 days." Melissa stared at the plans. She slowly smiled. "I've had 6 people debating this for 2 weeks." Stephen simply shrugged. "The drawings already had the answer." She laughed. "I swear you see buildings differently than everyone else." He returned the papers. "They're easier to understand than people." Melissa smiled again before walking away. It was a sentence Stephen probably didn't realize revealed more about him than he intended. He understood systems, patterns, structures. People were far less predictable, especially lately. That evening, Stephen returned home shortly after 6. The house looked immaculate. Fresh flowers stood on the dining table. Designer furniture filled every room. Everything reflected Violet's career as one of Chicago's most sought-after luxury interior designers. Clients paid extraordinary amounts for her ability to transform expensive homes into magazine-worthy spaces. Stephen had always admired her talent. He still did. But somewhere over the past 5 years, admiration had slowly become distance. Violet entered from her home office while ending a phone call. "Friday works. I'll have my assistant confirm." She ended the call without noticing Stephen until he placed his lunch bag on the kitchen counter. "Oh." "Long day?" he asked. "Busy." She opened the refrigerator. "I've got 3 new clients." "That's great." "It is." Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable, not angry, simply familiar. Stephen washed his coffee mug. Violet checked emails. The television remained off. Eventually she spoke. "The Donovans bought another lake house." Stephen nodded. "They've done well. They're hosting investors next month." "I'm sure it'll be nice." She sighed almost imperceptibly. "You know." He looked toward her. "Most husbands in that circle own companies." Stephen waited. "They don't wear maintenance uniforms." There was no shouting, no accusation, only observation. But the sentence lingered in the kitchen long after she walked upstairs. Stephen finished drying the dishes. His expression barely changed. Yet somewhere behind his calm eyes, another small crack quietly widened. He remembered when Violet used to brag about his work. Back when they first married. She once told friends that no matter what broke, Stephen always found a way to fix it. She used to admire that. Now she measured success differently. Luxury cars, executive titles, private clubs, vacation homes. Dinner conversations increasingly revolved around net worth instead of character. Stephen noticed every change. He simply chose not to argue about them, because arguments rarely changed beliefs. Actions did. After dinner, Violet sat in the living room scrolling through invitations on her tablet. Without looking up, she said, "Next Saturday." Stephen looked over. "What about it?" "The Reynolds Foundation Gala." "I remember." "You are coming." He hesitated. "I thought you usually attended those alone." "This one is different." "How?" "There will be investors, attorneys, developers, everyone important." Stephen smiled faintly. "Sounds like my absence wouldn't matter." "It would." She finally looked at him. "They expect spouses." He nodded once. "If you'd like me there, I'll come." She stared for a moment. Please don't wear your work jacket. I wasn't planning to. And maybe, she paused, borrow a newer suit. Stephen understood exactly what she meant. His charcoal suit was 8 years old, still perfectly tailored, still in excellent condition, still unfashionable by Violet's new standards. It still fits, he answered calmly. She forced a smile that never reached her eyes. We'll see. Later that night, Stephen sat alone on the back porch. Chicago's autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. The neighborhood had gone quiet. He looked across the dark yard, thinking not about the gala, but about how easily people confused appearance with value. Inside the house, Violet's phone vibrated again. She answered immediately. Her voice dropped lower. Stephen couldn't hear the conversation. Only fragments. I'll figure it out. Not over the phone. After the fundraiser. A few minutes later, she returned inside without mentioning the call. Stephen said nothing, but he noticed, just as he had noticed the unopened credit card envelopes disappearing before he reached the mailbox, the unfamiliar jewelry boxes, the increasingly expensive handbags, the small signs that something beneath the polished surface no longer fit together. He wasn't ready to draw conclusions. Not yet. Facts deserved patience. Assumptions deserved none. As he locked the back door before bed, his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed a name almost no one knew meant anything to him. Michael Reynolds. Stephen answered. Good evening. Michael's calm voice carried unusual warmth. I'll see you next Saturday. I'll be there. There was a brief silence. Then Michael added quietly, It's time people stopped seeing only the uniform. The call ended before Stephen could respond. He stood motionless in the dark hallway for several seconds. Upstairs, Violet was already asleep. Downstairs, Stephen slipped his phone back into his pocket. For the first time in years, he wondered whether an ordinary evening might quietly become the beginning of everything changing. Stephen arrived at Harbor Point Plaza before dawn again on Thursday, but unlike every other morning, his thoughts lingered on Michael Reynolds' phone call from the night before. It's time people stopped seeing only the uniform. The sentence stayed with him through every elevator ride and every maintenance inspection. He did not dislike the uniform. In many ways, it had protected him. People rarely became suspicious of the man carrying a toolbox. Executives spoke honestly around him because they assumed he wasn't part of their world. Investors ignored him. Consultants overlooked him. Construction crews trusted him. The uniform gave him access that expensive suits often could not. At 6:20 that morning, an emergency call came from the 22nd floor. One of Harbor Point's largest tenants, an investment advisory firm managing billions of dollars in client assets, had lost climate control inside its server room. The temperature had climbed 8 degrees in less than 15 minutes. If the cooling system failed completely, dozens of servers would automatically shut down. An outage during market hours could cost millions. Melissa Carter was already waiting when Stephen stepped off the freight elevator. We've got 2 contractors saying opposite things. Stephen walked past them without interrupting. He knelt beside an access panel, removed 4 screws, and listened. Not looked, listened. His eyes remained closed for several seconds. The contractors exchanged puzzled glances. Stephen reached inside the cabinet and touched one copper pipe. Then another. Finally, he stood. It isn't the compressor. One contractor frowned. It has to be. Stephen shook his head. The compressor is fine. The temperature says otherwise. The compressor isn't the problem. He pointed toward the opposite side of the mechanical room. The control valve isn't opening. Another contractor checked the monitor. It says it's open. Stephen smiled faintly. It says it is. He walked across the room and placed one hand on the actuator. No vibration. He looked back. The motor isn't moving. Within 3 minutes, they confirmed he was correct. A failed actuator worth less than $500 had nearly shut down equipment valued at over $40 million. Melissa exhaled heavily. "I've got to stop doubting you," Stephen answered with his usual calm. "You never do." She laughed. "Fair point." By 8 o'clock, the investment firm's offices had returned to normal. Most employees never knew anything had happened. Stephen preferred it that way. The best problems were the ones nobody remembered. Late that morning, while reviewing work orders in his office, his desk phone rang. "Facilities." "Still answering your own phone." Stephen recognized the voice immediately. Michael Reynolds. "It seems to work." Michael laughed. "I've been told billionaires aren't supposed to answer their own phones either." Stephen smiled. "You've never listened?" No. Neither man felt the need to fill silence. Their friendship had always been comfortable that way. Michael finally spoke. "Lunch. 12. My office." "I'll be there." Exactly at noon, Stephen drove 6 blocks to Reynolds Urban Development. The headquarters occupied the top 12 floors of a sleek glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. Anyone watching Stephen cross the marble lobby would have assumed he was a contractor arriving for routine maintenance. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Scott." "Afternoon, Emily." She immediately called upstairs. "He's here." Less than a minute later, the private elevator opened. Michael Reynolds himself stepped out. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit. At 58, Michael carried the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove success. He crossed the lobby without hesitation. Several executives watched curiously as one of Chicago's most respected developers greeted a facilities manager with a firm handshake. "Good to see you." "You too." They rode upstairs together. Michael's office overlooked Navy Pier and Lake Michigan. The walls displayed architectural models instead of awards. Stephen appreciated that. Michael poured coffee himself. No assistant, no ceremony. "You still take it black?" Stephen nodded. "You still buy coffee that's too expensive?" Michael laughed. "My accountant says the same thing." Lunch consisted of sandwiches from a neighborhood deli neither man had stopped visiting in 15 years. It had become tradition. Michael leaned back. "Do you remember the Jefferson Building?" Stephen smiled. "How could I forget?" 15 years earlier, Michael had nearly lost everything. The Jefferson Building had been Reynolds Urban Development's largest project to date. 2 weeks before opening, the building's automated mechanical systems began failing without explanation. Contractors blamed manufacturers. Manufacturers blamed engineers. Consultants produced reports. None solved the problem. Stephen had been working for another property management company then. He was 29, unknown. One afternoon, after listening quietly to hours of arguments, Stephen asked a single question. "When was the software updated?" Nobody knew. That answer bothered him. He spent 6 hours tracing every mechanical connection himself. Near midnight, he discovered a programming conflict introduced during the final software installation. The repair required less than 20 minutes. The project opened on schedule. Losses were avoided. Michael never forgot. "I tried paying you a consulting fee," Michael said. "You refused." Stephen remembered. "You offered too much." Michael smiled. "You deserved more." Instead, Stephen had accepted something entirely different. An opportunity. Michael slid a yellow legal pad across the table. "I asked you what you would have done differently if you'd owned the building." Stephen had filled 6 pages. Not with financial projections, not with architectural ideas, operational improvements, maintenance efficiencies, energy strategies, tenant retention systems, long-term cost reductions. Michael still kept those handwritten notes. "I've made more money from those 6 pages than from half my consultants." Stephen shook his head. You made the decisions. I made them because someone smarter than me showed me another way. That conversation had changed both men's lives. Within a year, Michael quietly invited Stephen to invest. The amount had been modest, $30,000, nearly every dollar Stephen had saved. Not because Michael needed the money, because he wanted Stephen committed beside him. Over time, they purchased neglected apartment buildings, not luxury towers, not downtown landmarks, working-class housing, buildings everyone else ignored. Stephen handled operational planning, renovation priorities, maintenance forecasting, tenant retention, vendor selection, every practical detail that transformed struggling properties into thriving communities. Michael handled financing, acquisitions, public negotiations, political relationships. Together, they built something neither could have created alone. Eventually, the business expanded into Indiana, Wisconsin, Southern Illinois. Yet almost nobody knew Stephen's role. The ownership records reflected legal entities, trust structures, holding companies, everything legitimate, everything documented. But Stephen never attended ribbon cuttings, never appeared in magazine interviews, never accepted awards. Michael asked him why only once. Stephen's answer never changed. If people know how much you have, they stop seeing who you are. Michael had respected that from the beginning. Now, however, circumstances had changed. "You've hidden long enough," Michael said quietly. Stephen looked toward the window overlooking the Chicago River. "I wasn't hiding. You were protecting your peace." Stephen nodded once. "There's a difference?" Michael folded his hands. "And is your peace still protected?" Stephen did not answer immediately. Instead, he thought about Violet, the conversations that had disappeared, the quiet criticism, the growing distance measured not in arguments but in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know anymore." Michael studied him carefully. "You've never talked much about your marriage. I don't believe in discussing private matters publicly." "I'm not asking publicly." Stephen managed a tired smile. "No." Michael waited. After several moments, Stephen finally admitted something he had not spoken aloud before. "I think she stopped respecting the man she believes I am." Michael remained silent. Stephen appreciated that. Sympathy was unnecessary. Understanding was enough. Michael stood and walked toward a cabinet near his desk. He removed a dark navy leather binder, the same binder Stephen had seen updated dozens of times over the years. Inside were ownership documents, investment agreements, expansion plans, records covering nearly 15 years of work. Michael placed one hand on the binder. "I'm bringing this to the gala." Stephen immediately understood. "You've decided?" "I have." Stephen looked at the binder for several long seconds. Once those documents became public, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. Not his reputation, not his marriage, perhaps not even his quiet life. He slowly nodded. "If that's what needs to happen." Michael finished the sentence for him. "Oh, then truth has waited long enough." Stephen looked out across the city one more time. Somewhere beyond the skyline, people continued believing they already knew exactly who he was. By next Saturday evening, many of them would discover they had been looking at the wrong man all along. Saturday morning arrived, wrapped in gray clouds drifting over Chicago. For most people, it was another weekend. For Violet Scott, it was an opportunity. The Reynolds Foundation Autumn Gala ranked among the city's most exclusive charity events. Invitations were limited. Attendance signaled influence more than generosity. Business partnerships often began over cocktails long before speeches started. Violet had spent nearly 2 weeks preparing. Her ivory evening gown had been custom-tailored. Her jewelry had been borrowed from one of her wealthiest clients. Even her hairstylist had rearranged appointments to accommodate the event. Everything had to communicate success. Everything had to look effortless. Stephen watched quietly while she reviewed the evening schedule over breakfast. "Cocktail reception starts at 6, she said without looking up. "Dinner at 7. He nodded. "The keynote is around 8:30. She continued scrolling through her tablet. The Reynolds family usually introduces major donors before dessert. Stephen simply listened. She finally looked toward him. "What time will you be home from work?" "I took today off." She looked mildly surprised. "You did? I thought it would make getting ready easier." "Oh?" The surprise disappeared almost immediately. "Good." Neither mentioned Michael Reynolds. Neither mentioned the phone call. Stephen had no intention of forcing information into conversations that were no longer naturally curious. After breakfast, he drove alone across the city. Not toward Harbor Point, not toward Reynolds Urban Development. Instead, he stopped at Rose Hill Cemetery. The grounds stretched quietly beneath enormous oak trees, whose autumn leaves covered the paths with shades of gold and crimson. Stephen parked beside a modest granite headstone. James Scott. 1949, 2018. Beloved husband, father, builder. He brushed away a handful of the leaves. "I've got somewhere to be tonight." The words sounded almost strange spoken aloud. He had visited his father's grave before every major decision in his adult life. Not because he believed answers waited there, because silence often helped him hear his own thoughts. His father had spent 40 years as a union carpenter. He built schools, hospitals, libraries, office buildings. People rarely remembered the names of the men who constructed them. Stephen remembered one lesson above every other. "Son, if your work speaks honestly, you never have to raise your voice." The sentence had shaped his entire life. He stood quietly for several more minutes. "I'm trying." The wind moved gently through the trees. Nothing answered, nothing needed to. When Stephen returned home just after noon, garment bags already hung across the master bedroom. Boxes from luxury boutiques covered the bed. Violet stood before a full-length mirror comparing earrings. She glanced toward him. "I scheduled your haircut yesterday." "I noticed." "You didn't complain?" "You were trying to help." She smiled faintly. "Thank you." For a brief moment, she looked like the woman Stephen had married 20 years earlier. Kind, hopeful, warm. Then her phone rang. The moment disappeared. She answered immediately. "Hi, Denise." Stephen recognized the name. Denise Whitmore, a luxury real estate agent. Divorced twice. Known for collecting wealthy friends the way some people collected artwork. Violet walked into the hallway while talking. Stephen carried his suit from the closet. The charcoal fabric remained in excellent condition. Classic, understated. He ran one hand across the lapel before hanging it carefully on the bedroom door. An hour later, the front doorbell rang. Denise entered carrying 2 shopping bags. She embraced Violet enthusiastically. "You look incredible already." "Come in." Stephen greeted her politely. "Good afternoon." Denise offered a quick smile before her attention shifted back toward Violet. "I brought those shoes." "Perfect." The women disappeared upstairs. Stephen remained downstairs organizing several household repair tools. Through the open staircase, he occasionally heard fragments of conversation. "Some?" "Venture capitalist." "Private jet?" "Owns 3 buildings." "Your husband still works maintenance." The voices lowered. Soft laughter followed. Stephen tightened one screw on his toolbox, then another. He neither interrupted nor reacted. People often revealed themselves most honestly when they believed no one important was listening. Around 3 o'clock, another vehicle stopped outside. This time it was Bradley Mercer, Violet's younger brother, 38 years old. regional sales executive for a medical equipment company. Confident, outgoing, always perfectly dressed. Bradley entered, carrying an expensive bottle of wine. "Steve." Stephen smiled warmly. "Good to see you." Bradley genuinely liked Stephen. Unlike some members of Violet's growing social circle, Bradley had never treated him poorly. He simply shared many of the same assumptions everyone else did. "You ready for tonight?" "I suppose." Bradley laughed. "I heard half of Chicago's business community will be there." "So Violet says." Bradley lowered his voice. "Between us." Stephen looked toward him. "You've got guts." "For attending?" "For surviving those events." Stephen smiled. "They're only dinners." Bradley chuckled. "Not these dinners." Upstairs, Violet called down. "Bradley, come help me." "I'm coming." He started upstairs before pausing. "You know?" Stephen looked up. "Violet worries too much about appearances." Stephen answered honestly. "Everyone worries about something." Bradley nodded. "I guess." He disappeared upstairs. Stephen returned to polishing his shoes. They were black leather Oxfords purchased nearly 10 years earlier, freshly shined, perfectly maintained, like everything else he owned. At 5 o'clock, Michael Reynolds called. "I'm outside." Stephen stepped onto the front porch. A dark gray Mercedes S-Class waited quietly at the curb. Michael remained inside. Stephen walked down. "You didn't have to pick me up." "I know." Michael handed him a slim envelope. Stephen opened it. Inside lay a simple Navy business card. Stephen Scott, managing partner, Reynolds Scott Property Holdings. No titles, no credentials, no logos beyond a discreet embossed design. Stephen looked toward Michael. "I thought we agreed never to print these." "We did." "What changed?" Michael smiled. "The truth." Stephen slipped the card back into the envelope. "I'm still wearing the maintenance uniform." "Not tonight." Stephen glanced down. His charcoal suit, polished shoes, simple tie. Nothing extravagant. "It feels strange." Michael nodded. "That's because you've spent 15 years letting everyone else underestimate you." Stephen looked back toward the house. Through an upstairs window, he saw Violet adjusting her earrings. She had no idea Michael was parked outside, no idea what rested inside the envelope, no idea what the evening would become. "I'll meet you there," Stephen said quietly. Michael studied him. "You sure?" "I need to arrive with my wife." Michael understood immediately. He nodded once. 7:30. 7:30. The Mercedes pulled away. Stephen stood watching until it disappeared around the corner. When he returned inside, Violet was descending the staircase. For several seconds, he forgot to speak. She looked beautiful, elegant, confident. The woman he had fallen in love with was still there, somewhere beneath years of growing ambition. "You look nice," she said politely. "So do you." She adjusted his tie without saying another word. Her hands paused briefly against his collar. Another small reminder of what they had once been. Then Denise walked into the foyer. "There you two are?" She looked Stephen up and down. "Well," a small smile appeared. "At least the suit fits." Violet laughed softly. "It does." Denise leaned toward Violet. "Just remember," her voice wasn't quiet enough, "don't let him disappear into conversations about investments." Violet smiled awkwardly. "I'll manage." Stephen opened the front door. "I'll get the car." "No," Violet replied quickly. "We're taking my Lexus." Stephen simply nodded. Of course they were. During the drive downtown, Denise occupied the passenger seat while Stephen sat quietly in the back. The women talked continuously. Luxury listings, vacation homes in Aspen, private schools, country club memberships. Nearly every story centered on money. Not once did either ask Stephen about his week. He didn't mind. Observation had always taught him more than conversation. As Chicago's skyline glowed beneath the evening lights, the enormous ballroom of the Palmer Grand Hotel came into view. Valets hurried between luxury vehicles. Photographers waited beside the entrance. Men in tuxedos greeted senators, CEOs, judges, and philanthropists. Violet stopped the car near the front entrance. She looked at Stephen in the rearview mirror, one slow breath, then another. Finally, she spoke the sentence that would quietly set the stage for everything about to happen. "Stephen, tonight just let me handle the introductions." The revolving doors of the Palmer Grand Hotel turned slowly beneath crystal chandeliers that poured warm light across polished marble floors. Every arriving guest carried an invisible resume. Some wore it as confidence, others wore it as jewelry. Stephen Scott wore neither. He stepped through the entrance beside Violet, his charcoal suit fitting as comfortably as the maintenance uniform he wore 5 days a week. His posture remained relaxed, his expression unchanged. He noticed details most people overlooked: the florist adjusting a centerpiece by half an inch, a nervous waiter straightening champagne glasses, the pianist quietly rehearsing a difficult passage before guests entered the ballroom. The evening had only begun, yet everyone already seemed to be performing. A hostess greeted them with practiced elegance. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Welcome to the Reynolds Foundation Autumn Gala." Violet offered her brightest smile. "Thank you." The hostess handed them name badges. Violet clipped hers on immediately. Stephen folded his into his pocket instead. "You aren't wearing yours?" Violet asked. "I'll keep it with me." She hesitated for a moment, but decided not to argue. "There are over 400 guests tonight," she said while scanning the room. "We'll probably split up for networking." Stephen nodded. "I expected that." She looked relieved by the answer. "Good." The cocktail reception occupied the hotel's grand ballroom foyer. Servers circulated carrying silver trays of champagne and sparkling water. Conversations overlapped into a constant hum. Names floated through the air: managing directors, partners, federal judges, hospital executives, private equity founders. People introduced themselves by what they owned more often than who they were. Stephen accepted a glass of sparkling water. One of the servers recognized him immediately. "Mr. Scott." Stephen looked carefully before smiling. "Marcus." Marcus Hill had once worked maintenance at Harbor Point while attending community college at night. Stephen had recommended him for a hospitality internship 2 years earlier. "I didn't know you'd be here," Marcus said. "My wife received an invitation." Marcus smiled sincerely. "It's good seeing you again." "You too." Marcus excused himself as another group approached. Violet had already moved 10 feet away, greeting another couple. Stephen followed at an easy pace. "Violet." A woman in an emerald evening gown embraced her enthusiastically. "Rebecca." Rebecca Collins owned a successful luxury marketing agency and had become one of Violet's closest professional friends. Beside her stood her husband, Jonathan Collins, managing partner at a corporate law firm. Introductions began naturally. "Rebecca, Jonathan. This is my husband, Stephen." Jonathan extended his hand warmly. "Nice meeting you." Stephen shook it firmly. "You as well." Rebecca smiled politely. "So, what do you do, Stephen?" Before he could answer, Violet spoke first. "He manages commercial buildings." Rebecca nodded. "Oh." The enthusiasm in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Jonathan remained courteous. "That must keep you busy." "It does." Stephen answered simply. He had learned years earlier that people often revealed more through the questions they stopped asking. Rebecca immediately turned back toward Violet. "I have to introduce you to someone." Within seconds, Stephen found himself half a step behind the conversation. It happened so smoothly that almost no one would have considered it rude. They simply assumed he had little to contribute. Another group joined them. Nathan Pierce, founder of Pierce Capital Partners, 49. Confident. Sharp gray suit. The kind of executive who evaluated people within seconds. Rebecca, Nathan said. Good to see you. Introductions began again. This is Violet Scott, Rebecca said. Nathan Pierce. They exchanged handshakes. Nathan noticed Stephen. And you are? My husband, Violet answered. Nathan smiled politely. What field are you in? Again, Stephen opened his mouth. Again, Violet answered first. Facilities management. Nathan nodded. Essential work. His tone remained respectful. Then came the inevitable follow-up. So, have you ever thought about moving into property investment that's usually the next step? Stephen was about to answer. Violet laughed lightly. Oh, Stephen has never really been interested in that world. Nathan smiled. Not everyone wants that pressure. Violet tilted her head. I think he just likes keeping life simple. Several people chuckled politely. Stephen merely took another sip of sparkling water. Nathan continued speaking about commercial acquisitions. The discussion quickly shifted toward investment opportunities, cap rates, tax incentives, redevelopment districts. Stephen recognized nearly every project they discussed. Some of the properties had once been evaluated by Reynolds Urban Development. Others belonged to competing firms. He remained silent. Not because he lacked knowledge, because no one had asked him. Across the ballroom, Michael Reynolds had just entered. His arrival subtly changed the atmosphere. Executives adjusted their posture. Board members walked toward him. Photographers gathered near the entrance. Michael greeted dozens of guests with practiced ease. Yet even while shaking hands, his eyes quietly searched the room. They found Stephen almost immediately, only for a second. No nod, no smile, only brief eye contact before Michael continued greeting donors exactly as planned. The surprise remained intact. Meanwhile, Violet continued introducing Stephen to one group after another. Claire Donovan, Senior Corporate Attorney. Eric Lawson, Executive Vice President of Lakeshore National Bank. Olivia Bennett, Chairwoman of the Reynolds Foundation Board. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Someone asked Stephen what he did. Violet answered before he could. People smiled politely. Then the conversation drifted elsewhere. Stephen noticed something interesting. No one insulted him directly. No one mocked his work. The judgment arrived more quietly than that. It appeared through lowered expectations. Shorter conversations. Eyes moving past him toward someone considered more important. He had experienced it before. It no longer surprised him. Near one of the ballroom windows, Violet joined a circle discussing second homes and investment portfolios. Stephen stood beside her. Nathan Pierce glanced toward him. So, Stephen, he smiled conversationally. What's your dream retirement plan? Stephen considered the question honestly. I'd like to restore an old farmhouse somewhere quiet. Nathan laughed pleasantly. No golf course. No. Private yacht. Stephen smiled. I get seasick. A few guests laughed. The mood remained friendly. Then Violet decided to add something. He actually means it. She smiled toward the group. Stephen has never cared much about money. Rebecca laughed. That's refreshing. Violet continued. Sometimes I tell him he could have accomplished more if he'd been a little ambitious. Several guests smiled awkwardly. Stephen looked calmly toward the ballroom stage. The pianist had stopped playing. Waiters began clearing cocktail tables. Dinner would begin soon. Nathan tried steering the conversation elsewhere. I'm sure success means different things to everyone. It does, Violet agreed. But honestly, she laughed softly again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he'd pushed himself a little harder. Another uncomfortable silence. Rebecca looked down at her champagne. Jonathan adjusted his glasses. No one quite knew how to respond. Stephen remained perfectly still, not embarrassed, not angry, simply listening. Violet mistook his silence for agreement. "He never complains," she continued. "He drives the same old pickup truck." A few polite smiles appeared. "He still packs lunch every day." Another small laugh. "And if you ask him what his biggest investment is," she looked affectionately toward Stephen, "he'll probably say replacing an air conditioning unit under budget." This time the laughter came slower, more uncertain. People sensed they were standing close to a line. Jonathan glanced briefly at Stephen. The expression on Stephen's face surprised him. There was no humiliation, no resentment, only quiet patience, as though he had heard far worse. Across the ballroom, Michael Reynolds had stopped speaking with a state senator. His attention rested entirely on Violet's group now. Standing beside him was Olivia Bennett. She followed his gaze. "Everything all right?" Michael answered without taking his eyes off Stephen. Not quite. He watched as Violet continued speaking. She never noticed him. Neither did anyone else. Michael slowly excused himself from the conversation. Instead of walking toward Stephen immediately, he approached the master of ceremonies standing beside the stage. The MC looked confused as Michael leaned close and spoke quietly into his ear. The man frowned. "Now," Michael nodded once. "Please delay page 3. The MC glanced down at the printed speech in his hands, then back toward Michael. Without another word, he quietly removed one page from the stack. On the opposite side of the ballroom, Stephen noticed the movement. He understood exactly what it meant. The evening had just changed. The ballroom lights dimmed by almost half. Conversations dissolved into scattered whispers as waitstaff quietly guided the final guests toward their assigned tables. Crystal glasses reflected hundreds of tiny points of light from the chandeliers overhead. The stage at the front of the room glowed beneath carefully positioned spotlights, framed by enormous digital screens displaying the Reynolds Foundation logo. A string quartet concluded the final notes of its performance. The master of ceremonies adjusted his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room settled. "On behalf of the Reynolds Foundation, thank you for joining us this evening." Polite applause rolled across the ballroom. Stephen remained seated beside Violet near the center of the room. Their table included Nathan Pierce, Rebecca, and Jonathan Collins Eric Lawson from Lakeshore National Bank, Claire Donovan, and 2 members of the Foundation's board. Violet straightened the place card before her. "This is the part where Michael usually thanks the donors," she whispered. Stephen nodded. "I've heard." She looked toward him. "You've never attended before?" "No." "So how would you know?" "I've watched the live stream once." She smiled faintly. "I forgot." The MC continued introducing sponsors, community partners, and scholarship recipients. Everything followed the printed schedule, exactly as every guest expected. Except one man already knew the schedule no longer existed. Standing behind the curtain, Michael Reynolds quietly folded the removed 3rd page and slipped it inside his jacket pocket. No one else saw him do it. No one except Olivia Bennett. She looked at him curiously. "You're really doing this?" Michael smiled. "It should have happened years ago." "You've protected him a long time." "He asked me to." "And tonight," Michael looked toward Stephen's table. "Tonight I'm honoring the request he never made." Olivia understood immediately. She smiled. "I think you're right." Michael walked onto the stage. The applause became louder. Everyone in the ballroom stood, some out of admiration, some because everyone else had. Michael acknowledged the crowd with his usual calm confidence before approaching the podium. "Please," he motioned gently. "Have a seat." The audience settled again. He thanked sponsors first, then volunteers, then city officials. His delivery was measured, relaxed, no unnecessary drama. Exactly the style that had made him one of Chicago's most respected business leaders. He spoke about affordable housing, neighborhood revitalization, long-term investment, community responsibility. Everything appeared entirely ordinary. Stephen listened quietly. Violet occasionally leaned toward Rebecca, exchanging brief comments about upcoming charity auctions. 20 minutes passed. Michael reached the final page remaining on the podium. The MC standing backstage frowned. According to the printed program, the speech should have continued another 5 minutes. Instead, Michael closed the folder. He looked across the ballroom. Silence stretched for several seconds, long enough that people began exchanging puzzled glances. Then Michael smiled. "Before we conclude," his voice softened, "I'd like to recognize someone who has spent nearly 15 years making this work possible." Several heads turned. Foundation board members looked toward one another. None knew who he meant. Michael stepped away from the podium. No longer reading, no longer following notes, simply speaking. When people tour our developments, he walked slowly across the stage. They often compliment the architecture. He paused. They praise the financing. Another step. They congratulate me. He smiled gently. I always accept those compliments. Another pause. But I've accepted far too many that belonged to someone else. Stephen felt every eye in the room beginning to move. Not toward him. Not yet. Toward wherever Michael's gaze settled. Nathan Pierce whispered to Eric Lawson, "I wonder who he's talking about." Eric shrugged. "No idea." Michael continued. 15 years ago, I met a young man during what was easily the worst construction crisis of my career." Soft laughter spread through the audience. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. Another step. He wasn't the highest paid consultant. Another. He didn't have the most impressive title. He stopped walking. But he solved the problem everyone else had failed to solve. Stephen lowered his eyes briefly. He knew the story. He had heard Michael tell parts of it before. Never publicly. Never like this. Michael smiled towards the audience. That night, I learned something important. He pointed gently toward the crowd. The smartest person in the room isn't always sitting at the head table. Several guests nodded. Michael continued. Sometimes he's the one everyone mistakes for ordinary. Violet crossed one leg over the other, still unaware. Rebecca leaned closer. I wonder who it is. Nathan quietly scanned nearby tables. The room had become almost perfectly silent. Michael took one slow breath. For 15 years. He looked directly toward Stephen. He asked for no recognition. The spotlight operator instinctively followed Michael's line of sight. A single beam of light swept slowly across dozens of tables. Past senators, past judges, past CEOs, past philanthropists. Until it stopped, directly above Stephen Scott. Violet blinked. Nathan frowned. Rebecca turned. Jonathan looked from Stephen to Michael. Stephen remained seated, completely still. Michael smiled warmly. There you are. A murmur moved across the ballroom. People looked around uncertainly. Some assumed the spotlight had landed on the wrong guest. Michael laughed softly. I've been looking forward to saying this for years. He stepped to the very edge of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen. He extended one hand toward Stephen. Would you please welcome my business partner? Another pause. Mr. Stephen Scott. Nothing happened. Not immediately. The room seemed to forget how to react. Applause never started. Conversation stopped. Even the photographers hesitated. Violet slowly turned toward her husband. Her expression emptied. She looked from Stephen to Michael, then back again. Nathan Pierce stared openly. Eric Lawson removed his glasses. Rebecca whispered, almost inaudibly. What? Michael waited patiently. He knew disbelief required time. Stephen finally stood. No dramatic gesture, no triumphant smile. He simply buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. The movement alone seemed impossible to many people watching. Nathan leaned toward Violet. "I'm sorry." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Did he say partner?" Violet opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Michael spoke again. "Not a consultant." He smiled. "Not an advisor." Another pause. "My partner." The silence deepened. Then someone near the back began clapping. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across the ballroom. Not loud, not yet. Tentative, confused, curious. People applauded because Michael Reynolds had asked them to. Few understood why. Stephen walked calmly toward the stage. Every step seemed to slow time itself. Dozens of guests recognized him. The quiet man standing beside his wife during cocktails. The facilities manager. The husband who barely spoke. The man Violet had introduced over and over again as ordinary. Halfway to the stage, Stephen passed Nathan Pierce. Nathan instinctively stood. "So," he stopped himself. Words suddenly felt inadequate. Stephen simply smiled politely and continued walking. At the edge of the stage, Michael reached down and grasped Stephen's hand firmly, not a ceremonial handshake. The grip of two men who had built something together over many years. Michael helped him onto the stage. The applause finally grew louder. Cameras flashed continuously now. Photographers crowded forward. Reporters whispered urgently into phones. Near the front table, Violet remained frozen in her chair. Her champagne glass tilted slightly inside her trembling hand. A single drop spilled onto the white tablecloth. She never noticed. Neither did anyone watching her. Every eye remained fixed on the two men standing beneath the stage lights. Michael rested one hand gently on Stephen's shoulder. "I think," he said into the microphone, smiling toward the audience, "it's finally time everyone learned who has really been helping build our company." The ballroom became silent once again, even quieter than before, because every person in the room suddenly understood that whatever came next was about to change everything they thought they knew. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The applause faded naturally into complete silence. Stephen stood beside Michael beneath the bright stage lights, one hand resting loosely at his side. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge the cameras. He simply waited. Michael looked across the ballroom with the confidence of a man who had spent decades making difficult decisions. "I imagine," he began with a small smile, "many of you are wondering whether I misspoke." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the audience. "I didn't." His voice became steady again. "When I introduced Stephen Scott as my business partner, I meant exactly that. Every camera lens focused on the stage. Nathan Pierce leaned forward in his chair. Claire Donovan folded her hands, watching quietly. Eric Lawson stopped taking notes on the event program. Violet remained completely still. She could hear nothing except the sound of her own heartbeat. Michael continued. 15 years ago, I met Stephen because one of my developments was hours away from becoming the most expensive failure of my career. The large screens behind the stage changed. Instead of displaying the Reynolds Foundation logo, they showed an old photograph. A younger Michael Reynolds stood beside an unfinished office tower. Steel beams stretched into the sky. Construction cranes surrounded the building. Several guests recognized it immediately. "The Jefferson Tower project," someone whispered. Michael nodded. "Exactly." He looked towards the audience. "That project represented nearly everything my company owned at the time." He smiled briefly. "And nearly everything we were about to lose." The next photograph appeared. Construction workers, mechanical equipment, blueprints spread across folding tables. Then another image. A young man wearing a Navy maintenance uniform. Stephen, 15 years younger, holding a flashlight while studying a mechanical control panel. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. "He wore the same uniform," Rebecca whispered. Jonathan nodded slowly. "It looks almost identical." Michael continued. "Consultants charged us hundreds of thousands of dollars. Another photograph appeared. Teams of engineers, outside specialists, conference rooms filled with expensive presentations. They produced reports. Another image. They held meetings. Another. They argued." He paused. "But none of them solved the problem." The ballroom remained silent. Michael smiled toward Stephen. "This young facilities supervisor walked into the mechanical room and asked one question nobody else had considered." He looked back toward the audience. "When was the control software updated?" Several engineers seated near the back exchanged glances. Michael nodded. It turned out to be exactly the right question. Another photograph appeared. Stephen kneeling beside electrical equipment. No cameras, no spotlight, just a man doing his job. "He solved the problem before sunrise." Michael smiled warmly. "He also saved my company." The audience responded with quiet applause. Michael allowed it to settle before continuing. "I offered him a consulting contract." Stephen remembered the conversation clearly. Michael remembered it too. He declined. Soft laughter returned. "I doubled the offer." Another smile. He declined again. Nathan leaned toward Eric. "I've never heard of anyone refusing Michael Reynolds 15 years ago." Eric shook his head. "Neither have I." Michael continued. "So I asked him a different question." The screens changed again. This time they displayed 6 handwritten notebook pages, old, slightly yellowed, covered with neat blue handwriting. Stephen recognized them immediately. His notes. Michael pointed toward the screen. "I asked him what he would improve if he actually owned the building." He smiled. "These 6 pages became the blueprint for nearly everything we built afterward." Guests leaned forward. Some squinted to read portions of the writing. Operational efficiency, long-term maintenance reserves, energy management, resident satisfaction, preventive maintenance schedules, vendor accountability, community partnerships. Not one page discussed luxury. Not one page discussed prestige. Every line focused on making buildings work better for the people living inside them. Michael folded his hands. That was the day I realized Stephen understood buildings differently than anyone I had ever met. The audience remained completely engaged. Michael took another step toward the podium. "So instead of hiring him," he looked toward Stephen, "I invited him to become my partner." A new image appeared. Not a photograph this time, an official document. Its sensitive information had been covered, but one section remained perfectly visible. Founding members: Michael Reynolds, Stephen Scott, data formation 15 years earlier. The room erupted into whispers. Nathan stared at the screen. Claire adjusted her glasses. Eric slowly leaned back. Violet looked up at the enormous document as though seeing a foreign language. She had never seen it before. Not once. Michael continued calmly. The company wasn't called Reynolds Urban Development. Another screen appeared. A Navy logo, simple, professional. Lakeshore Community Holdings, LLC. Most of you have probably never heard of this company. Several investors nodded. Some hadn't. Others clearly had. Nathan's expression changed. I know Lakeshore Community Holdings, he whispered. Eric turned toward him. So do I. Nathan looked stunned. They've acquired more than 30 properties over the past decade. Claire quietly added, they're one of the most disciplined private investment groups in the Midwest. Michael nodded as though hearing them. That was intentional. He smiled. We never chased headlines. The screen changed again. Now a map filled the ballroom. Colored markers spread across Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, affordable housing communities, Mixed-use redevelopment projects, neighborhood revitalization efforts, commercial renovations. The number appeared beneath the map. 38 completed developments, over 6,000 residential units, thousands of families served. Another figure followed. Private investment portfolio, $412,000,000. The audience gasped, almost in unison. No one laughed now. No one whispered jokes. Nathan Pierce slowly looked toward Stephen again. The facilities manager, the man he had casually advised to consider investing in real estate less than an hour earlier. Stephen stood exactly as before, calm, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Michael smiled. "Most people assume I built this." He shook his head. "I didn't." He pointed gently toward Stephen. "We built it." Applause began again. Longer this time. Stronger. Not because Michael had asked for it, because people finally understood. When the applause ended, Michael raised one hand. "I know the next question." He smiled toward the audience. "If Stephen helped build a $400 million portfolio," he looked around the ballroom, "why does he still spend every weekday managing commercial buildings?" Nathan realized he had asked exactly that question in his own mind. Michael looked toward Stephen. "I could answer." He smiled. "But I think everyone should hear it from him." For the first time that evening, Michael handed Stephen the microphone. Stephen accepted it slowly. He looked out across hundreds of faces: executives, judges, attorneys, investors, reporters. Many of those same faces had barely noticed him during the cocktail reception. Now every one of them waited. Stephen didn't speak immediately. He had never enjoyed public speaking. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was thoughtful. Finally, he smiled. A small, genuine smile. "When people ask what I do," his voice carried calmly through the ballroom, "I've always answered honestly." Another pause. "I manage buildings." A few guests smiled. "Because that's exactly what I do." He looked toward Michael. "I've simply been fortunate enough to help manage a few more than most people realized." Soft laughter spread naturally through the room. Even Michael laughed. The tension eased, but Stephen wasn't finished. He looked across the ballroom once more. His eyes briefly settled on Violet. Not with anger, not with accusation, only quiet sadness. Then he turned back towards the audience. "And there's another reason." He paused. "I never wanted my bank account to become the most interesting thing about me." The room became silent again. Every person listening sensed that the real answer, the one that explained everything about the man standing before them, was only beginning. Stephen held the microphone with both hands for a moment, as though weighing every word before allowing it into the room. He had spent most of his life avoiding stages. He preferred boiler rooms, mechanical drawings, maintenance schedules, places where solutions mattered more than speeches. Now 400 pairs of eyes waited for him. "I've been asked more than once tonight," Stephen said evenly, "why I still manage buildings if I've had the opportunity to do something else." He smiled faintly. "The simplest answer is that I never believed managing buildings was something less." The ballroom remained perfectly still. Stephen continued. "When I was 12 years old, my father took me to a construction site outside Columbus." A few guests leaned forward. He pointed to a brick school that had just been finished. Stephen's voice softened. "He asked me a question." Another pause. "Do you know who'll remember the man who built this place?" Stephen looked briefly toward the floor before answering the question himself. "Almost nobody." He lifted his eyes again. "But thousands of children will spend years inside it." Silence spread across the ballroom. "My father taught me that useful work doesn't become more valuable because someone applauds it." Several guests nodded. Nathan Pierce slowly folded his arms. For the first time that evening, he stopped evaluating Stephen as an investor. He began listening to him as a man. Stephen continued. When Michael invited me to become his partner, I accepted because I believed we could improve neighborhoods that other people ignored. He gestured lightly toward the map still displayed behind him. We bought apartment buildings no one wanted. Another slide appeared. The first property they had purchased. Peeling paint, broken windows, an overgrown parking lot. It wasn't glamorous. The next photograph appeared. The same building 18 months later. Fresh brickwork, children riding bicycles, families carrying groceries, flower boxes beneath the windows. Our business was never about collecting buildings. Stephen looked across the room. It was about giving people better places to come home to. A gentle round of applause began. Stephen waited until it faded. The reason I kept working my regular job wasn't because I needed another paycheck. He smiled. It was because I never wanted to become disconnected from the people who actually keep buildings alive. Several property managers in attendance exchanged approving looks. Every week I still talk to electricians, plumbers, custodians, security guards. They notice problems long before executive reports do. He shrugged gently. So I kept listening. Michael watched from beside him with unmistakable pride. He had heard this philosophy many times in private. It sounded even stronger, spoken aloud. Stephen looked toward the audience again. I've attended hundreds of mechanical failures. Soft laughter. I've crawled through ceiling spaces. Another smile spread through the ballroom. I've spent Christmas mornings fixing broken boilers. The laughter became warmer. And honestly, he looked toward Michael. Those experiences probably made me a better business partner than another board meeting would have. Even Michael laughed openly. The atmosphere changed. The mystery surrounding Stephen slowly transformed into genuine respect. No dramatic revenge, no arrogance, only quiet honesty. At table 12, Rebecca Collins lowered her champagne glass. I owe him an apology. Jonathan glanced toward her. For what? I judged him within 30 seconds. Jonathan nodded. So did I. Across the ballroom, Eric Lawson leaned toward Claire Donovan. I've reviewed financing packages from Lakeshore Community Holdings. Claire looked at him. So have I. I never knew. Claire smiled knowingly. That was probably the point. Eric slowly shook his head. How many people in this room do you think underestimated him tonight? Claire looked around the ballroom. Almost everyone. Nathan Pierce remained unusually quiet. His mind replayed the conversation from the cocktail reception. So, have you ever thought about moving into property investment? The memory suddenly felt embarrassing. He wasn't embarrassed because Stephen had turned out to be wealthy. He was embarrassed because he had assumed Stephen couldn't possibly understand investments. The realization stung. On the opposite side of the stage, Olivia Bennett stepped toward the podium. She whispered something to Michael. Michael nodded. Would you mind if I shared one more story? He asked Stephen. Stephen smiled. It's your stage. Michael turned toward the audience. Actually, he picked up another remote. I think everyone should see this. The screen changed once more. Instead of photographs or financial figures, a spreadsheet appeared. Columns, maintenance budgets, repair schedules, inspection reports. No one immediately understood what they were seeing. Michael explained. These are operating records. He enlarged one section. Every property we own follows maintenance standards that Stephen designed himself. He clicked again. Average emergency repair costs. 28% below the regional average. Another slide. Resident retention, 94%. Another. Energy efficiency savings. Millions of dollars over 10 years. Michael smiled. Most investors chase quarterly returns. He looked toward Stephen. My partner taught me to think in decades. The applause came again. Longer, more confident. Reporters began writing furiously. Several guests quietly took photographs of the presentation. Stephen looked slightly uncomfortable. Attention had never been his goal. Michael noticed. He leaned toward the microphone. I know Stephen well enough to tell you that he's already wishing this presentation would end. The ballroom laughed together. Stephen smiled helplessly. Michael continued. He has spent 15 years avoiding recognition. He looked across the audience. Tonight isn't happening because he wanted applause. His expression became more serious. It's happening because credit belongs where credit is due. The applause that followed carried a different tone. Not excitement, respect. When the room quieted again, a woman near the front raised her hand. She introduced herself after a microphone reached her. Emily Foster, Chicago Business Journal. Stephen nodded politely. She smiled. I hope you don't mind one question. Go ahead. She hesitated carefully. Did your wife know about all of this? The ballroom instantly became silent. Every guest understood why the question mattered. Dozens of eyes shifted toward Violet. She remained seated. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass. Stephen looked toward her for only a brief second. His expression revealed neither satisfaction nor anger, only compassion. He returned his attention to the reporter. My wife knew that Michael and I had known each other for many years. He paused. I kept the details of our ownership interests private. Emily nodded. So, she chose her words carefully. This evening surprised her too. Stephen answered honestly. Yes. Nothing more. He offered no criticism, no explanation, no attempt to embarrass Violet. The restraint impressed the audience even more than the revelation itself. Nathan quietly whispered to Rebecca, he could destroy her right now. Rebecca nodded. But he isn't. Michael watched Stephen closely. That single answer told him everything. Even after the humiliation during the cocktail reception, Stephen had refused to retaliate. He had protected Violet's dignity at the very moment he had every opportunity not to. Claire Donovan noticed the same thing. She quietly folded her event program. There was something else she had observed during the presentation, something no one else seemed to notice. When Michael had changed slides, one image had appeared for less than 2 seconds before advancing. Most guests had been too focused on Stephen to pay attention. Claire had not. She had clearly seen the title of a legal folder, Annual Ownership Review. She recognized the formatting immediately. It had been prepared by her own law firm. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. If that folder was here tonight, then Michael had planned for something beyond a public introduction. Something legal, something formal. Claire looked toward the navy leather binder resting on a small table beside the podium. Michael followed her gaze. Without saying a word, he walked over and placed one hand firmly on top of it. The gesture was deliberate. Stephen noticed it immediately. So did Claire. Neither of them spoke, but both understood. The evening was far from over. The applause gradually faded into the familiar rhythm of silverware against porcelain. Waiters resumed serving dinner, though far fewer people seemed interested in eating. Every conversation in the ballroom now revolved around one subject: Stephen Scott, the quiet facilities manager, the hidden partner, the man almost everyone had underestimated. Stephen returned to his seat after thanking Michael with a simple handshake. As he approached the table, every person sitting there instinctively stood, not because etiquette required it, because their perception of him had changed. Nathan Pierce extended his hand first. Stephen. His confident voice from earlier had softened. I owe you an apology. Stephen accepted the handshake. For what? Nathan let out a quiet breath. I assumed I understood who you were after one conversation. Stephen smiled politely. Most people do. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. I shouldn't have. Stephen simply nodded. No harm done. There was no sarcasm, no hidden message, only sincerity. Nathan found that almost harder to process than the revelation itself. Rebecca Collins spoke next. I hope you didn't think we were being disrespectful. Stephen pulled out his chair. I didn't. But Violet kept answering every question for you. I noticed. And you never corrected anyone. Stephen looked around the table. I've learned that people usually reveal more about themselves when they aren't interrupted. No one immediately replied. The sentence lingered longer than anyone expected. Claire Donovan quietly observed Stephen while unfolding her napkin. She had spent 23 years practicing corporate law. One lesson had remained constant. People who possessed genuine confidence rarely rushed to prove anything. Stephen reminded her of those clients. Not loud, not defensive, certain enough to remain calm. Across the ballroom, Michael continued greeting donors, but his eyes occasionally returned to the navy leather binder resting beside the podium. Claire noticed it again. The binder hadn't moved. Neither had Michael's assistant. Someone was deliberately guarding it. That wasn't accidental. She made a mental note. Violet had barely spoken since Stephen returned to the table. She stared toward her untouched dinner plate. The roasted salmon had begun to cool. Her wine remained untouched. She replayed the previous hour again and again. Every introduction, every joke, every sentence. He never really chased success. He likes keeping life simple. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he'd pushed himself harder. Each one echoed differently now. Not because Stephen had become wealthy, because she suddenly realized he had never defended himself. He had allowed every misunderstanding to exist. She quietly turned toward him. Stephen? He looked at her calmly. Yes. Her voice failed. For the first time in years, Violet had no carefully prepared words. Stephen waited patiently. After several seconds, she managed only one sentence. I didn't know. I know. Nothing more. No accusation. No lecture. His kindness somehow made the silence even heavier. Dinner continued. Conversation slowly shifted back toward business. Only now the questions flowed toward Stephen instead of around him. Eric Lawson adjusted his glasses. I've financed several redevelopment projects over the years. Stephen nodded. I believe we met once. Eric looked surprised. We did. 5 years ago. Stephen smiled faintly. You were reviewing a municipal refinancing package. Eric searched his memory, then suddenly laughed. You were wearing work boots. I had just come from a mechanical inspection. My goodness, Eric leaned back. I thought you were part of the maintenance contractor. I was, Eric blinked. And the owner. Stephen nodded once. The two weren't mutually exclusive. Soft laughter spread around the table. This time no one laughed at Stephen. They laughed at themselves. Nathan shook his head. I've spent 25 years teaching younger partners not to judge clients by appearances. He smiled awkwardly. I suppose I needed the lesson more than they did. Stephen answered gently. We all make quick assumptions. Nathan looked toward him. The difference is whether we recognize them. Claire smiled almost imperceptibly. She appreciated that answer. It assigned responsibility without humiliation. Exactly the sort of response experienced negotiators admired. A few minutes later, dessert was served. Coffee followed. The formal program appeared to have ended. Guests gradually left their tables to continue networking. Within minutes, another circle formed around Stephen. Not because he sought attention, because attention had found him. One developer asked about neighborhood revitalization. Another requested advice regarding operating costs. A nonprofit director wanted recommendations for affordable housing. Stephen answered every question the same way he had spoken all evening, directly, briefly, without exaggeration. He admitted when he didn't know something. He credited other people whenever possible. Several guests quietly remarked to one another that Michael Reynolds suddenly made perfect sense. This was exactly the kind of partner he would choose. Across the ballroom, Violet stood alone near one of the windows overlooking the Chicago River. The city lights shimmered across the water below. She barely noticed them. Denise Whitmore approached carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "I've been looking for you." Violet accepted one automatically. Neither woman drank. Denise spoke first. "So," a long pause followed. "Did you really have no idea?" Violet slowly shook her head. "No. None. No." Denise studied her carefully. "You've been married 20 years. "I know. And he never mentioned any of this." Violet looked through the window. "He never lied." Denise frowned. "What do you mean?" "He just—" She struggled to explain. "Never volunteered information I never asked about." Denise stared at her. "That's impossible." Violet shook her head again. "No." Memories began resurfacing, conversations she had dismissed, questions she had never bothered asking. The weekend Stephen occasionally spent reviewing documents, his meetings with Michael, the phone calls, the legal envelopes that always arrived addressed personally to him. She had assumed they involved building maintenance. She had never cared enough to ask, not because she trusted him completely, because she believed nothing especially important could possibly be inside. That realization hurt more than surprise itself. She had mistaken indifference for certainty. Back near the stage, Claire Donovan finally approached Michael Reynolds. "Congratulations," she said. Michael smiled. "Thank you." Claire glanced toward the leather binder. "You're planning something else tonight?" Michael studied her for a moment. "You noticed. I recognized one of the documents during your presentation." Michael nodded. "I suspected you might." Claire lowered her voice. "My firm prepared the annual ownership review." "It did. You intentionally brought the originals." "I did." Claire folded her hands. "Why?" Michael rested one hand on the binder. "Because tonight wasn't only about giving Stephen the recognition he deserves." He paused. "It was also about protecting him." Claire's expression changed. "Protecting him from what?" Michael looked across the ballroom. Stephen was speaking with a young non-profit director, while several investors listened attentively. Only then did Michael answer. 3 weeks ago, one of our compliance officers noticed something unusual." Claire became completely attentive. "What kind of unusual?" Michael opened the binder just enough to remove a single document. He handed it to her. Claire read the first page. Within seconds, the warmth disappeared from her face. Her legal instincts immediately recognized the significance: an unauthorized financial authorization request. The signature line carried Stephen Scott's printed name, but the handwriting wasn't his. She looked up sharply. "This was submitted." Michael nodded. "It was intercepted before anything happened." Claire turned another page. Supporting bank information, transfer instructions, corporate account references. Everything appeared professionally assembled. Too professionally. She looked back toward Michael. "Who filed it?" Michael's expression remained calm. "We don't know yet." Claire closed the file carefully. "But someone attempted to access partnership assets." "Yes. And they used Stephen's identity." Michael nodded again. "Exactly." Claire looked across the ballroom toward Stephen. He was smiling politely while answering another question about community housing, completely unaware she was studying him. Finally, she looked back toward Michael. "Does Stephen know?" Michael glanced toward his partner. "He knows something needs to be investigated." Claire tightened her grip on the document. "But he doesn't know how serious this is." Michael quietly closed the binder. Not yet. Across the room, Stephen happened to look toward the stage. His eyes met Michael's for only a brief second. Then he noticed something else. Claire Donovan was holding one of the legal documents from the binder. Her expression had become unmistakably grave. Stephen understood immediately. Whatever Michael had just shown her had nothing to do with tonight's celebration. Stephen excused himself from the small group gathered around him with the same quiet courtesy he had shown all evening. If you'll excuse me for a moment. The nonprofit director smiled. Of course. Several investors stepped aside to let him pass. Only an hour earlier, many of those same people had barely noticed him. Now they watched him cross the ballroom as though every movement carried meaning. Stephen approached the stage at an unhurried pace. Michael remained beside the podium. Claire Donovan stood next to him, the navy leather binder closed once again. The concern on Claire's face had not disappeared. Stephen noticed it immediately. What happened? Michael looked toward Claire. I thought you should hear this from both of us. Stephen nodded. Go ahead. Claire spoke first. Do you remember signing any authorization documents during the last month? Stephen thought carefully. No. Any requests involving partnership accounts? No. Any ownership transfers? No. Claire exchanged a glance with Michael. That's what I expected. She opened the binder. Inside, every document rested inside clear protective sleeves, each separated by labeled tabs. Nothing was loose. Nothing appeared rushed. The organization reminded Stephen of Michael's office. Methodical. Intentional. Claire carefully removed a single page. She placed it on a nearby cocktail table. I'd like you to look at this. Stephen stepped closer. At first glance, it resembled hundreds of financial authorization forms he had reviewed over the years. Corporate account, transfer request, authorized signature. Then his eyes reached the bottom. His printed name appeared beneath the signature line. The signature itself looked remarkably similar to his own. Remarkably. But not perfectly. Stephen studied it for several silent seconds. Finally, he looked up. It isn't mine. Claire nodded. I know. Michael folded his arms. Our compliance department reached the same conclusion. Stephen lowered his eyes again. Whoever had signed the document had clearly practiced. The shape of the letters resembled his handwriting. The spacing looked convincing. Even the slight upward angle matched his natural signature. Only one detail felt wrong. The pressure. Stephen always pressed harder on the final two letters of his last name. This signature remained perfectly even, almost mechanical. He pointed quietly. There. Claire leaned closer. The ending. She examined it carefully. I see it. The person copied how my signature looks. Stephen tapped lightly on the paper. They didn't copy how I actually write. Claire smiled faintly. That's exactly what our forensic handwriting specialist reported. Stephen looked toward Michael. When was this submitted? 17 days ago. And intercepted. The same afternoon. Stephen remained silent. Around them, the ballroom continued buzzing with conversation. No one nearby realized a completely different discussion was taking place only a few feet away. Michael lowered his voice. We didn't want to involve you until we understood what we were looking at. What do we know now? Claire answered. We know someone attempted to authorize a transfer from one of Lakeshore Community Holdings' operating reserve accounts. How much? $8 million. Stephen showed almost no visible reaction. Not because the number was insignificant, because reacting emotionally would not change the facts. Was the transfer completed? No. Why not? Claire smiled slightly. Your company has an unusually strict approval process. Stephen looked toward Michael. Your idea. Michael shook his head. Ours. Claire continued. Every transaction above $1 million requires 2 independent confirmations. Stephen nodded. I remember. The request failed because the second confirmation never happened. Stephen looked back at the document. So whoever submitted this expected one signature to be enough. Exactly, Michael added quietly. They didn't understand how we designed the system. Stephen almost smiled. 15 years earlier, he had insisted on multiple layers of verification. At the time, several advisors argued the process would slow business. Stephen had disagreed. Security should be inconvenient, he had told Michael. If it's easy for us, it'll eventually become easy for someone else. Michael had adopted the recommendation. Now that decision had quietly prevented the loss of $8 million. Claire carefully slid another document across the table. This is where things become more interesting. Stephen read the heading. Logan Activity Report. Multiple access attempts. Several dates. Different locations. Most originated from downtown Chicago. One came from Naperville. Another from Oak Brook. All had failed. What am I looking at? Claire answered immediately. Someone repeatedly attempted to access partnership records using your credentials. Stephen looked up. They had my username. Yes. My password. They guessed incorrectly. Stephen nodded once. I change it every month. Michael smiled. I know. Stephen continued reviewing the report. The failed attempts stretched across nearly 6 weeks. Patient, persistent. Whoever was responsible had not acted impulsively. They had been preparing. Did they ever gain access? Claire shook her head. No. Stephen exhaled quietly. What else? Michael hesitated. There is something. Claire opened another section of the binder. This document came from Lakeshore National Bank, Eric Lawson's institution. She turned it towards Stephen. A customer inquiry. Stephen read carefully. Someone had requested general information about partnership accounts. The request itself had been denied. The name of the person making the inquiry had been redacted pending legal review. Stephen looked toward Claire. You don't know who it was. We know. She paused. We simply aren't ready to accuse anyone until every piece of evidence is verified. Stephen nodded approvingly. Good. Michael smiled. I knew you'd say that. Stephen looked back toward the ballroom. Guests laughed. Servers collected empty dessert plates. A jazz trio had begun playing quietly near the entrance. The evening appeared completely normal. Only the 3 people standing beside the stage understood that a criminal investigation might already be unfolding beneath the celebration. Claire closed the binder again. I've spent 23 years practicing corporate law. She looked directly at Stephen. I've learned something. What? The truth survives careful examination. Stephen nodded. So does deception. Claire continued. We don't need theories. We need documents. Michael rested one hand on the binder. And that's exactly what we've been collecting. Stephen studied both of them. How many people know about this? Very few. Our compliance director. Our forensic accountant. Myself. Claire. And now you. Stephen thought for several moments. What about law enforcement? Not yet. Claire answered calmly. We don't report suspicions. We report evidence. Stephen appreciated the distinction. He had always believed serious decisions deserved complete information. Half-finished conclusions often created lasting damage. Michael watched Stephen carefully. I wanted tonight to remain about recognition. Stephen smiled faintly. It still can. Michael frowned slightly. You aren't upset. Stephen looked toward the forged signature once more. I'll be upset if we fail to uncover the truth. He gently closed the folder. Until then, he looked at both of them. This is simply another problem waiting to be solved. Claire almost laughed. That's exactly how you describe broken elevators. Stephen smiled. The principle isn't very different. She shook her head in quiet admiration. No, it isn't. Across the ballroom, Violet noticed Stephen speaking privately with Michael and Claire. The three stood close together. The navy binder remained open. Documents changed hands. No smiles, no celebration, only serious conversation. A strange feeling settled inside her. She had assumed the surprise on stage had been the entire story. Now she realized it had merely opened another door. Whatever rested inside that binder mattered far more than public recognition. She took an unconscious step toward them, then stopped. For the first time in years, she understood something painful. She no longer knew enough about her own husband to know whether she even belonged in that conversation. Meanwhile, Claire carefully returned every page to its proper place. She locked the binder with a small brass clasp. The click echoed softly between the three of them. Then she looked directly at Stephen. From this moment forward, she said, every conversation, every email, every financial record, and every document connected to this matter needs to be preserved. Stephen answered without hesitation. I've been keeping records my entire life. Claire nodded. I suspected you had. Michael picked up the binder. Good. He looked from Claire to Stephen. Because tomorrow morning, he paused deliberately, we begin following the evidence wherever it leads. Sunday morning arrived without the noise of the previous evening. No cameras, no applause, no ballroom filled with astonished faces. Chicago looked ordinary again beneath a pale autumn sky. Stephen woke before sunrise, as he always did. He brewed coffee, read the newspaper, watered the small maple tree growing beside the back porch. Routine had always helped him think clearly. Inside the house, however, nothing felt routine. Violet came downstairs just after 7. She had barely slept. The elegant confidence she had carried through the gala had disappeared, replaced by quiet uncertainty. For a few moments they stood in the same kitchen without speaking. Stephen poured another cup of coffee. If you'd like some... She looked up. Thank you. He placed the mug on the counter. No resentment, no coldness, just simple courtesy. Violet wrapped both hands around the warm cup. I kept thinking about last night. Stephen nodded once. I imagined you would. I don't know where to begin. You don't have to begin this morning. She looked at him. You aren't angry. Stephen considered the question carefully. I'm disappointed. The honesty hurt more than anger would have. I never intended to humiliate you. I know. You should have told me. Stephen remained quiet for several seconds. When we married, I tried. Violet frowned. What do you mean? You used to ask about every meeting. He smiled faintly. You wanted to know what I was working on. She searched her memory. I remember. Then little by little you stopped asking. His voice never changed. You assumed maintenance was all I had to talk about. Violet lowered her eyes. Stephen continued. I didn't hide my life from you. He paused. You simply stopped being interested in it. Silence settled over the kitchen. There was nothing dramatic about the observation. That was precisely why it was impossible to dismiss. Violet remembered dozens of evenings, Stephen mentioning he would meet Michael. She had assumed they were discussing boilers, maintenance contracts, building inspections. She had never once asked another question, because she believed she already knew the answers. I'm sorry, she whispered. Stephen gave a small nod. I appreciate that. His phone vibrated. Michael Reynolds. Stephen answered immediately. Morning? We're meeting in an hour. I'll be there. Claire Donovan joined the call. Our forensic accountant has completed another review. Stephen listened. We've found additional activity. I'll leave now. The call ended. Stephen placed the phone into his jacket pocket. I need to go. Violet stood. Can we talk tonight? He looked at her for a long moment. If we're both ready to listen. She nodded. I will be. 45 minutes later, Stephen walked into the conference room at Reynolds Urban Development. The atmosphere differed completely from the celebration the night before. Coffee cups, laptops, legal pads, no decorations, no speeches. Around the table sat Michael Reynolds, Claire Donovan, David Ellis, the firm's forensic accountant, and Karen Mills, Lakeshore Community Holdings compliance director. Karen stood as Stephen entered. Good morning. Morning. She handed him a thick folder. We've organized everything chronologically. Stephen immediately noticed color-coded tabs, login records, financial requests, internal communications, vendor correspondence. David Ellis activated the large display screen. I'll begin with confirmed facts. Stephen appreciated the wording. Confirmed facts, not theories. David displayed a timeline. 6 weeks ago, a highlighted entry appeared. Someone attempted to access partnership records through our online portal. Next entry. 5 weeks ago. Another failed login, then another, then another. The attempts became increasingly frequent. None succeeded. David looked around the room. Whoever this person was. He pointed towards the screen. They didn't understand Stephen's password habits. Stephen smiled faintly. I change them too often. David nodded. Fortunately. The next slide appeared. A bank inquiry, then another. Finally, the forged authorization request. David spoke carefully. At first, we believed these might be unrelated. He changed slides. We no longer believe that. Stephen leaned forward slightly. What changed? Karen answered. We discovered every incident involved the same target. Our operating reserve account. Stephen nodded. The one requiring dual authorization. Correct. David zoomed in on another document. More importantly, he highlighted several timestamps. Every attempt occurred during weekday business hours. Michael frowned. So, David looked toward him. So whoever was responsible knew Stephen would likely be working. Claire immediately understood. They assumed he wouldn't notice. David nodded. Exactly. Stephen quietly studied the timeline. Nothing jumped out immediately. Then something caught his attention. He pointed toward 2 entries. Why are these exactly 28 days apart? David looked surprised. You noticed? Stephen nodded. They're almost identical. David smiled. So are we. He changed to another slide. Calendar dates, corporate events, travel schedules, meeting logs. Patterns slowly emerged. Karen spoke. The attempts consistently happened when Michael was attending public events. Michael folded his arms. So they expected me to be distracted. David nodded. And they expected Stephen to be occupied with his regular job. Stephen looked at the screen without speaking. The planning impressed him. Not because it had succeeded, because it had been patient, methodical. Someone had observed their routines. Someone believed they understood how both men worked. Claire broke the silence. That tells us something important. Stephen looked toward her. This wasn't random. No. It was prepared. Michael added quietly, someone waited. Stephen nodded. So will we. David changed to another document. This came in late last night. A digital security report. Stephen scanned the first page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. There was another attempt, David nodded. During the gala. The room became silent. Karen continued. While everyone believed attention was focused on the stage, she tapped the report. Someone tried accessing the partnership portal again. Michael frowned. From where? David enlarged the location. Downtown Chicago, less than 1 mile from the hotel. Stephen stared at the address. Whoever it was had remained close enough to monitor the gala while attempting to exploit the distraction. The timing wasn't coincidence. Claire slowly closed her notebook. I think we should stop assuming this is merely financial. Michael looked toward her. What are you suggesting? She answered carefully. Someone understood your schedule. She looked toward Stephen. They understood his routine. Another pause. And they knew exactly when both of you would be least likely to notice. Stephen quietly folded his hands. Which means, he finished the thought himself. They've been watching for much longer than 6 weeks. No one disagreed. David switched off the projector. The conference room suddenly felt much quieter. Michael stood and walked toward the window overlooking the Chicago River. For 15 years, we've built this company without major incident. He turned back toward the room. I don't intend to lose that because someone believes patience belongs only to them. Stephen stood as well. Neither man raised his voice. Neither sounded emotional. Stephen simply looked at the folders spread across the conference table. Let's continue exactly the way we've always operated. Claire looked toward him. Meaning, he answered without hesitation. Document everything. Karen nodded. Already underway. Verify every assumption. David nodded. Of course. And don't accuse anyone until the evidence leaves no other explanation. Claire smiled. I couldn't have given better legal advice. Michael looked at Stephen with quiet approval. This is why you've always been my partner. Stephen reached for the thick investigation folder. As he lifted it, a single sealed envelope slid from the back and landed on the table. No return address. Only 4 typed words across the front. For Stephen Scott. Every person in the room fell silent. None of them remembered placing it inside the file. The conference room fell completely silent. No one reached for the envelope immediately. Stephen looked at the cream-colored paper resting near the center of the table. It had no stamp, no return address, and no company logo. Only 4 neatly typed words appeared across the front. For Stephen Scott. Claire Donovan was the first to speak. Don't touch it yet. Stephen withdrew his hand. David Ellis slid a pair of nitrile gloves from his briefcase. I'll photograph it first. Within minutes, the envelope had been photographed from every angle. Karen Mills noted the time. 9:42 a.m. chain of custody documentation began before anyone broke the seal. Michael smiled faintly. This is exactly why I hire lawyers. Claire didn't smile back. This is exactly why people hire lawyers. David carefully opened one edge with a letter opener. Inside lay a single folded sheet of paper. Nothing else. No fingerprints were immediately visible. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the conference table. The message contained only one sentence. Stop looking or the next mistake won't stay inside the company. No signature. No handwritten notes. Nothing identifying its sender. Michael read it twice. So, his voice remained calm. They know we're investigating. Claire nodded. Or they want us to believe they do. Stephen studied the wording. They didn't ask for money. No. They didn't admit anything. No. They only referenced the next mistake. Claire looked toward him. What does that tell you? Stephen thought quietly. Whoever wrote this believes intimidation is more useful than negotiation. David nodded. I had the same impression. Stephen continued. And they understand enough about us to know we'll continue looking. Michael folded the letter. They're probably right. Claire took the page and placed it inside a protective evidence sleeve. "We'll preserve this." She looked toward Stephen. "I also recommend notifying law enforcement." Stephen didn't object. "I agree." Claire seemed mildly surprised. "You usually prefer waiting?" "I prefer evidence." Stephen looked toward the letter. "I think this qualifies." Michael reached for his phone. "I'll contact Detective Laura Mitchell." Claire looked up. "The Financial Crimes Unit." Michael nodded. "She handled one of our fraud cases 3 years ago." Within 30 minutes, Detective Laura Mitchell arrived. She wore a navy blazer over plain business attire rather than a police uniform. Practical, professional, early 50s. She greeted everyone with a firm handshake. After introductions, Claire summarized the situation. Forged authorization request. Repeated login attempts, financial inquiries, anonymous warning. Detective Mitchell listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, the detective asked only one question. "Has anyone been publicly identified as having access to these accounts?" Michael answered. "No." "Then whoever sent this letter already knew Stephen's role before last night's announcement." The room became quiet again. Stephen looked toward her. "You think so?" "I do." She pointed toward the evidence sleeve. "This sentence says the next mistake won't stay inside the company." She paused. "That wording assumes knowledge of an internal investigation." David frowned. "So they weren't reacting to the gala?" "No. They were reacting to our response." Stephen considered that carefully. "So the public announcement wasn't what frightened them?" Detective Mitchell nodded. "The investigation was." Michael slowly exhaled. "Interesting." The detective closed her notebook. "I'd like copies of every document." Claire smiled. "They're already prepared." "I thought they might be." As the detective reviewed the files, Stephen's phone vibrated. Violet. He stared at the screen for a moment. Michael noticed. "You should answer." Stephen stepped into the hallway. "Hello?" Violet sounded exhausted. "Are you busy?" "A little." "I won't keep you." Silence followed. Then she quietly asked, "Can I tell you something honestly?" "You always could." Another pause. "I don't think I liked the person I became." Stephen leaned against the hallway window overlooking the river. "What makes you say that?" "I spent the entire night remembering conversations." Her voice shook slightly. "Not just yesterday. Years. I realized I stopped asking about your day." Stephen remained silent. "I stopped caring about what mattered to you because I assumed I already knew who you were." She took a slow breath. "And somewhere along the way..." Another pause. "I started measuring your worth by things that never mattered to you." Stephen closed his eyes briefly. He had hoped she would eventually understand. He simply hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. "I'm sorry." The words sounded genuine, not rehearsed, not defensive. "I don't expect forgiveness today." She continued before he could respond. "I just needed you to know I finally understand what I did." Stephen looked out toward the Chicago River. Boats moved slowly through the water below. "I appreciate you telling me. Will you come home tonight?" "I will. I'll be there." The call ended. Stephen slipped his phone back into his pocket before returning to the conference room. Detective Mitchell had finished reviewing the documents. "I have 2 recommendations." Everyone looked toward her. "First, nobody discusses this investigation outside this room." She looked directly at Stephen. "Not even with family?" Stephen nodded. "Understood." "Second," she pointed toward the forged authorization, "we assume every future move by the person responsible will leave another document." Michael smiled slightly. "You think they'll make another mistake?" I don't believe criminals become careless. She closed the file. I believe they become confident. Stephen recognized the distinction immediately. Confidence encouraged repetition. Repetition created patterns. Patterns created evidence. Claire looked toward Stephen. What are you thinking? He answered quietly. If they've spent weeks studying us. He paused. Then we've spent weeks unknowingly studying them. Michael smiled. There it is. Claire tilted her head. What? The way Stephen solves problems. Michael looked around the room. He never asks who first. He asks what repeats. Stephen walked toward the timeline still displayed on the conference screen. Every failed login, every bank inquiry, every document request, every attempted transfer. He stared at them for nearly a full minute. Then he pointed toward 3 separate dates. These weren't chosen randomly. David stood beside him. You see something? Stephen nodded slowly. They all happened on Thursdays. David blinked. So, Stephen pointed again. My maintenance schedule. Everyone looked confused. Stephen continued. Every Thursday morning I'm underground inspecting mechanical systems. He looked toward Michael. My phone has almost no signal. Understanding slowly spread across the room. Claire spoke first. So whoever planned these attempts knew there would be a window when you were temporarily unreachable. Stephen nodded. Exactly. Detective Mitchell smiled for the first time. Now we're getting somewhere. David quickly opened another spreadsheet. If that's true. He began comparing employee schedules, visitor logs, maintenance calendars, and access records. Rows of data filled the screen. After several moments, one name appeared repeatedly alongside those Thursday mornings. Not every week, but often enough to demand attention. David stopped typing. The room became silent once more. He looked slowly toward Claire. I think, he swallowed. We've just found our first real lead. No one spoke for several seconds. The conference room seemed smaller than before. David Ellis kept his eyes fixed on the spreadsheet projected across the wall. One name. Repeated often enough to matter. Not enough to prove guilt. Enough to justify a closer look. Claire Donovan was the first to break the silence. Don't say it out loud yet. David immediately nodded. I wasn't planning to. Detective Laura Mitchell closed her notebook. Good. She walked toward the screen and studied the timeline herself. I've seen too many investigations damaged because someone became excited by the first coincidence. Stephen remained seated. His attention stayed on the pattern instead of the name. The timing matters more than the person. Claire looked toward him. Explain? Stephen stood and approached the display. He pointed to the highlighted Thursdays. If this individual is involved, he paused. Their name is only one piece of evidence. He traced the sequence with his finger. But this schedule, another pause. This is behavior. Detective Mitchell smiled slightly. Go on. People can explain why their name appears somewhere. Stephen looked at everyone in the room. It's much harder to explain why the same behavior repeats over 6 weeks. David nodded. The timestamps. Stephen smiled. Exactly. He enlarged another column. Every suspicious login attempt occurred within a 25-minute window. 8:35 a.m., 8:42 a.m., 8:39 a.m., 8:37 a.m. Always Thursday. Always during Stephen's underground inspections. Always before Michael's weekly executive meeting. Claire folded her arms. So whoever planned this understood both of your routines. Stephen nodded. And expected those routines to remain unchanged. Michael looked toward Detective Mitchell. What happens now? The detective answered without hesitation. We verify every movement connected to those dates. Karen Mills opened another folder. We maintain electronic visitor records, David added. So does Harbor Point. Stephen immediately understood. If someone entered both buildings... He didn't finish the sentence. David already knew. We'll compare access logs. Claire looked toward Michael. No interviews. No accusations. No changes in policy. Michael nodded. We continue operating normally. Detective Mitchell smiled. Exactly. If the person responsible realizes we've narrowed our search, she glanced toward the anonymous letter sealed inside an evidence bag. They'll stop making mistakes. Stephen quietly returned to his chair. The meeting continued another hour. Electronic records were assigned, security footage requested, financial activity preserved. Every task followed one principle. Facts first, conclusions later. By early afternoon, the conference room had emptied. Only Stephen and Michael remained. Michael stood beside the window overlooking the Chicago River. I've been thinking. Stephen looked up. Dangerous habit. Michael laughed. You've always said that. It usually is. The laughter faded. Michael became serious again. I owe you an apology. Stephen frowned slightly. For what? I should have told you about the investigation sooner. Stephen considered it. No. You protected the evidence. I protected you. Stephen shook his head. You protected both. Michael looked at him carefully. You're taking all of this remarkably well. Stephen looked through the window. I've spent my career solving problems. He smiled faintly. This just happens to be one involving paperwork instead of plumbing. Michael laughed again. I'll never understand how your mind works. My father used to. Michael nodded thoughtfully. I wish I'd met him. You would have liked each other. There was another comfortable silence. Finally, Michael spoke. How are things with Violet? Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a tugboat move slowly beneath one of the river bridges. I don't know. Last night changed everything. It changed many things. Michael looked toward him. Do you still love her? Stephen answered honestly. Yes. Another pause. But love isn't the same thing as trust. Michael nodded slowly. No. It isn't. Late that afternoon, Stephen drove home. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles. A man washed his pickup truck across the street. Someone mowed a lawn despite the approaching autumn. Ordinary life continued. Stephen appreciated that. When he stepped inside the house, he immediately noticed the smell. Fresh bread, tomato soup, roasted chicken. Violet almost never cooked anymore. She stood in the kitchen wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater. No designer clothes, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what remained from the morning. She looked more like the woman he had married than the woman who had attended the gala. You made dinner. She nodded. I wasn't sure what else to do. Stephen placed his keys on the counter. It smells good. I remembered your mother's recipe. He looked at her with quiet surprise. You still have it? I found it this morning. They sat across from one another at the small kitchen table. Not the formal dining room, the kitchen. The place where they had eaten almost every meal during the first years of their marriage. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence no longer felt distant. It felt careful. Finally, Violet looked up. I called Denise. Stephen waited. I told her I won't be attending the Aspen fundraiser next month. He nodded. All right. I also resigned from the Country Club Design Committee. Again, he nodded. You don't have to explain. I'm not explaining. She looked directly at him. I'm changing. Stephen studied her expression. He believed she meant it. Whether that change would last. Only time could answer. Violet folded her hands together. I've been asking myself one question all day. What question? She took a slow breath. When did I become embarrassed by the best man I've ever known? Stephen looked down at his soup. He had wondered the same thing many times. I don't know. I think I do. She smiled sadly. It happened one compromise at a time. She looked toward the window. One client, one party, one comparison, one expensive neighborhood. I started surrounding myself with people who talked about success every day. She paused. Eventually, I forgot how to recognize it. Stephen listened quietly. No interruption, no correction. She continued. When people praised their husbands because they owned companies. She shook her head. I stopped appreciating the husband who quietly helped build one. A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. I'm ashamed of that. Stephen remained silent for several moments. Then he finally spoke. I never wanted you to admire me because of money. I know. I wanted you to know me. Another tear appeared. I stopped trying. No. Stephen looked gently toward her. You stopped looking. The distinction mattered. She understood immediately. I did. They finished dinner slowly. No dramatic reconciliation. No promises. Only honesty. As Stephen carried the dishes toward the sink, his phone vibrated. A text message from David Ellis. The access logs are complete. We have a confirmed match. Stephen stared at the message. Another followed almost immediately. You need to come to Michael's office first thing tomorrow morning. The evidence is stronger than we expected. Stephen slowly locked the phone. Across the kitchen, Violet noticed his expression change. What happened? Stephen looked toward her. The investigation just found something. He paused. And I think tomorrow is going to answer a question that's been waiting much longer than any of us realized. Stephen arrived at Reynolds Urban Development at 7:10 the next morning. The city was only beginning to wake. Delivery trucks rolled along Wackard Drive, commuters crossed the bridges over the Chicago River, and the glass towers reflected the first pale light of the day. Inside the conference room, everyone else had already arrived. Michael Reynolds stood beside the window. Claire Donovan had 3 organized folders spread across the table. David Ellis was reviewing spreadsheets on 2 monitors. Detective Laura Mitchell sat quietly with a notebook, saying nothing. Karen Mills placed another stack of printed access logs in front of Stephen. You'll want to see this first. Stephen took the top page. The report compared electronic building access from Harbor Point Plaza with visitor records from Reynolds Urban Development Security Badge activity and network login attempts. David pointed to a highlighted section. We expanded the timeline. Stephen read carefully. Every suspicious Thursday followed the same pattern. At 8:12 a.m., Stephen entered Harbor Point's mechanical level. At approximately 8:35 a.m., an unauthorized login attempt occurred. Within minutes of each attempt, one particular access badge appeared inside a public area near the business district. Always the same badge, always within the same 40-minute window, always on Thursdays. David folded his hands. One coincidence means very little. He pointed at the next page. 6 identical patterns mean something else. Stephen nodded slowly. Consistency. Exactly. Claire slid another document across the table. This came from Harbor Point Security Department. Stephen immediately recognized the format. Visitor registration, elevator access, loading dock entries, maintenance requests. Nothing unusual appeared until the final page. There, highlighted in yellow, was another pattern. The same individual had repeatedly requested access to mechanical corridors on Thursday mornings, not because they needed repairs, because they claimed to be verifying vendor deliveries. Stephen looked up. I've never assigned these inspections. Karen answered. We checked. No one did. Detective Mitchell leaned forward. So whoever submitted these requests created their own reason to be near Stephen's work area. Stephen continued reading. The requests had always been approved automatically because they appeared routine. No one questioned them. That was precisely what made them effective. Michael finally spoke. They weren't trying to hide. Stephen looked toward him. They were trying to blend in. Michael nodded. Just like you. The observation hung in the room. Stephen had spent years discovering that ordinary appearances often opened more doors than impressive titles. Now someone else had apparently reached the same conclusion. David switched to another screen. This is where the investigation changed. A spreadsheet filled the display. Employee schedules, vacation requests, payroll records, building access, calendar entries. Every category had been cross-referenced. David highlighted one line. Look here. Stephen leaned closer. Every suspicious Thursday also matched another recurring event. Someone consistently left the office 30 to 45 minutes earlier than scheduled. Not enough to attract attention. Enough to create an opportunity. Claire looked toward Detective Mitchell. That matters. The detective nodded. It establishes planning. David clicked again. A map appeared. Cell tower locations, parking garage entries, traffic camera timestamps. He enlarged several overlapping circles. The movements are consistent. Stephen followed the route. Downtown, River North, West Loop, always ending near the same commercial district where the unauthorized network access had originated. David quietly closed his laptop. I believe we've reached the point where the evidence supports a formal interview. Claire immediately corrected him. A voluntary interview. For now. Detective Mitchell agreed. No arrests. No accusations. We ask questions. Stephen appreciated the restraint. Too many investigations failed because people rushed toward conclusions before completing the evidence. Michael looked around the room. Who conducts the interview? Detective Mitchell answered. I will. Claire added, I'll attend. David nodded. So will I. Everyone looked toward Stephen. He understood the unspoken question. Should he be there? He thought for several moments. Then he slowly shook his head. No. Michael looked surprised. You don't want to hear the answers? I do. Stephen folded the access reports neatly. But if this person sees me, he paused. The conversation becomes emotional. Claire smiled slightly. And if you're absent? It stays factual. Detective Mitchell nodded with approval. I agree. Michael leaned back in his chair. I've spent 15 years watching you solve problems. He smiled. You never make them personal. Stephen answered quietly. The facts are personal enough. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. Claire gathered the legal files. David backed up every electronic record onto encrypted storage. Karen notified the compliance department that all relevant documents would remain under legal preservation. Nothing dramatic happened. No officers rushed through hallways. No one stormed into offices. The investigation advanced exactly the way Stephen believed serious matters should, one verified fact at a time. By early afternoon, Stephen returned to Harbor Point. His work schedule had not changed. The cooling tower on the roof still required inspection. A faulty elevator sensor still needed replacement. An HVAC contractor waited for approval on the 18th floor. Melissa Carter met him near the maintenance office. I watched the gala online. Stephen smiled. I figured you might. She folded her arms. So? A small grin appeared. Should I start calling you Mr. Managing Partner? Stephen laughed softly. I hope not. Melissa smiled. I didn't think so. She looked at him for a moment. You know what's funny? What? Nothing about you seems different. Stephen looked down the hallway where two maintenance technicians were unloading equipment. I'd be disappointed if it did. Melissa nodded. I guess that's why people trust you. As they spoke, Luis Ramirez walked into the office carrying a maintenance log. He had also heard the news. His eyes widened. "So, all those years," Stephen smiled. "Morning, Luis." Luis laughed. "You really weren't going to tell anybody, were you?" "No." Luis shook his head in amazement. "My wife watched the video 3 times. Stephen chuckled. "I hope she enjoyed it." "She said the best part wasn't the announcement." Stephen looked curious. "What was—" Luis smiled. "The way you never tried to embarrass your wife." Stephen became quiet. He hadn't realized people noticed that. Apparently they had. Far more than he expected. Late that afternoon, as Stephen finished inspecting a rooftop air handling unit, his phone vibrated. A message from Detective Laura Mitchell. "Interview completed. Please come to Reynolds Urban Development. No further explanation, no details." Stephen looked across the Chicago skyline. The wind carried the first real hint of approaching winter. He placed his tools back into the service case and headed toward the elevator. 40 minutes later, he walked into Michael's office. The room felt different, not tense, not excited, resolved. Claire stood beside the conference table. David had closed every laptop. Detective Mitchell looked directly at Stephen as he entered. No one spoke immediately. Stephen knew enough about investigations to understand that silence often arrived before important news. Finally, Detective Mitchell slid a single typed statement across the table. The interview answered several questions. Stephen looked at the document but did not pick it up. And created one much bigger one. Michael slowly placed his hand on the statement. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried unusual weight. "Stephen." He paused. "No, the person we interviewed admitted they didn't act alone." The room remained silent after Michael spoke. Stephen looked at the typed statement on the conference table, but still did not touch it. He had learned long ago that documents deserved to be read carefully, not emotionally. Detective Laura Mitchell broke the silence. "The individual admitted to submitting false maintenance access requests." Stephen nodded once. "They also admitted attempting to gather information about your schedule." Claire Donovan added calmly, "They denied creating the forged authorization." Stephen finally looked up. "But they admitted helping someone else." Detective Mitchell nodded. "Yes." She slid another page across the table. "They said they believed they were helping gather information for what they were told was an internal ownership audit." Stephen read quietly. The employee had been promised a consulting opportunity with another firm. Small payments had been disguised as reimbursement for outside contract work. At first, the requests seemed harmless. Confirm when Stephen would be underground. Verify whether Michael was in executive meetings. Observe who attended quarterly partnership reviews. Nothing about bank accounts. Nothing about forged signatures. Only information. Information that later became part of a much larger plan. Stephen finished reading. "They were manipulated." Detective Mitchell answered carefully. "They still made serious mistakes." She paused. "But based on the evidence, they weren't directing the scheme." Claire folded her hands. "The financial fraud required knowledge they didn't possess." Michael slowly walked toward the window, overlooking the river. "So we're still missing the person who organized everything?" "No," Detective Mitchell replied. "I don't believe we are." Everyone looked toward her. She opened a sealed evidence folder. Inside rested several printed emails, phone records, bank transaction summaries. She spread them across the conference table in chronological order. "People who organize financial fraud rarely begin with money." She pointed toward the earliest document. "They begin with information." Another page. Then access. Another. Then opportunity. Finally, she placed one last document at the end of the sequence. "And eventually," she tapped the paper gently, "they make contact." Stephen studied the final page. A meeting record. private lunch reservation. Downtown Chicago, 6 weeks earlier. The person interviewed had met another individual at a restaurant only 3 blocks from Harbor Point Plaza. The restaurant's security footage had already been preserved. Claire looked toward Detective Mitchell. You identified the second person? We have. Stephen remained silent. He had expected this moment to feel dramatic. Instead, it felt strangely calm. Truth rarely arrived with excitement. It arrived one verified fact at a time. Detective Mitchell continued. We won't discuss that person's identity until formal charges are filed. Stephen nodded. I understand. Michael looked at him. Aren't you curious? I am. You aren't going to ask? Stephen smiled faintly. If you've reached this point. He looked toward the evidence spread across the table. The answer will arrive soon enough. Claire smiled. That's probably the most disciplined response anyone has ever given me. The detective closed the file. My office will continue the criminal investigation from here. She looked directly at Stephen. As far as you're concerned, you've done exactly what you should. What was that? You documented. She smiled. You stayed calm. Another pause. And you allowed evidence to speak before emotion. Stephen thanked her with a quiet nod. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No celebration followed. No victory speeches. Only handshakes, professional gratitude, and the understanding that justice often continued long after public attention disappeared. 3 months later, winter had settled over Chicago. Snow covered sidewalks throughout the West Side, where Reynolds Scott Property Holdings had just completed another affordable housing community. Children built snowmen between newly planted maple trees. Parents carried groceries into warm apartments. A maintenance technician adjusted exterior lighting, while another inspected the heating system before the evening temperature dropped below freezing. Stephen walked the property wearing the same navy work jacket he had always worn. Residents greeted him without knowing he co-owned the development. Morning. Everything working all right? So far. He checked a boiler room, reviewed maintenance logs, spoke with custodians, asked a young family whether the new insulation had improved heating costs. It had. That mattered more to him than any headline. Outside, Michael Reynolds joined him. He looked around the neighborhood with quiet satisfaction. Remember the first building we bought? Stephen smiled. The one with broken windows. And raccoons in the basement. Stephen laughed. I remember. Michael looked across the apartment complex. We've come a long way. Stephen nodded. So have these neighborhoods. A ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for noon. Local officials, community leaders, families, construction workers, maintenance employees. Unlike the gala, this gathering wasn't about prestige. It was about people finally moving into safe homes. When the ceremony began, the mayor thanked Reynolds Urban Development for its continued investment. Michael accepted the recognition graciously. Then, just as he had at the gala, he stepped away from the podium. I've learned something over the past 15 years. He looked toward the crowd. The people receiving credit aren't always the people doing the most important work. Several construction workers smiled knowingly. Michael motioned toward Stephen. I'd like my partner to say a few words. Stephen sighed, almost imperceptibly. Michael laughed. I know. The audience laughed with him. Stephen approached the microphone. Unlike the gala, he recognized many faces. Electricians, plumbers, building supervisors, carpenters. People who understood that meaningful work often happened long before ribbon cuttings. He spoke briefly. My father spent 40 years building places where other people lived, learned, and worked. He paused. He told me something I'll never forget. A light snow began falling. If your work improves someone else's life, you've already succeeded. Stephen looked towards the families standing together beneath winter coats. I've tried to remember that every day, he smiled. I hope these homes make life a little easier for everyone who lives here. That was all. No discussion of wealth, no mention of investigations, no reference to the gala. The applause lasted much longer than his speech. Afterward, a little girl tugged gently on the sleeve of his jacket. "Excuse me." Stephen knelt to her height. "Yes. My mom says you helped build our home." Stephen smiled. "A lot of people helped." She held out a crayon drawing. It showed a brick apartment building beneath a bright blue sky. 3 people stood outside holding hands. Across the top, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for our new home." Stephen accepted the drawing carefully. "I'll keep this." She grinned. "Promise." "I promise." As the families gradually returned inside to escape the cold, Michael walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," he said, handing one to Stephen, "people finally know who you are." Stephen looked at the children laughing in the snow. "I hope not." Michael raised an eyebrow. "No. I hope they know what we've built." He looked down at the child's drawing folded safely inside his coat pocket. "Who I am has never been the important part." Michael smiled. Still the same man. Stephen looked toward the old Ford F-150 parked near the maintenance shed. Same truck, same watch, same quiet routine. Only one thing had truly changed. He no longer felt any need to let other people's assumptions define his worth. Some truths required years to become visible, but once they did, they no longer needed defending. They simply stood on their own. People often judge others by titles, clothing cars, or the conversations they hear at social events. Those things are easy to notice, but they rarely tell the whole story. Character is revealed much more slowly through consistency, humility, and the choices someone makes when no one is watching. Stephen never proved his value by arguing with those who underestimated him. He allowed his work, his patience, and documented truth to speak for him. In everyday life, we all meet people whose real struggles, talents, or achievements remain invisible. Sometimes we are the ones being underestimated. Other times we are the ones making assumptions. This story reminds us that lasting respect is built through integrity, preparation, and calm judgment, rather than appearances or public recognition. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment with your country, your local time, and tell us about a moment when someone underestimated you or when you realized you had judged someone too quickly. Your story may encourage someone else who is quietly working toward something meaningful. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, integrity, and unexpected justice, be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story follows another ordinary person whose quiet decisions change far more lives than anyone imagined.